Well, in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about some of the recent geopolitical changes and how that affects internal audit and potentially the audit plan in priorities for many people in internal audit and many organizations around the world here, especially in the next few months and potentially the next 4 years. So, one thing is for certain, and that is the world is changing very rapidly. So with the national election here in the United States, and the new administration, there have been a lot of things going on. I mean, the news every single day there are new things that are coming out in the news about how the government is changing, things that are happening, and that it causes a lot of different issues. Okay, and so the first one that we're not really going to talk about is how it affects people personally, because this has become a very tumultuous time, and this is leading to a lot of divisiveness and arguing between people. But for purposes of this video, what I want to do is, we're not going to talk about that, but what I want to do is talk about what you can actually control, right? Because you may personally agree, you may personally disagree with some of the things that the US government is doing, that other governments around the world are doing, some of the different geopolitical things that are happening. And while it's important to you, right, it doesn't necessarily impact your job or your organization. And so in today's discussion, I want to, make sure that we are being dispassionate about it, and that we're looking at it from a standpoint of, okay, these things are happening, they're facts, they're events. Now, what can your organization and what can you do about it? Okay. And we had this discussion today in our audit leader forum call, which is a group of people that we get together and we talk twice a month about some of the things that are going on. And today, one of the people in the group brought up, at first, kind of the whole idea about the Department of Government Efficiency here in the US and how quickly they have been able to identify, or at least what they're portraying as, certain examples of waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, and what they're doing to try to change some of that. And so the discussion first started of, how did they do this so quick? How can we do this a little bit quicker, as well, in our own organizations, right? And it quickly moved into, okay, well, let's talk about what are some of the impacts that these changes could have. And, there's been a lot of talk, there's a lot of media out there about things that are happening. And the first thing is to just temper yourself a little bit. Don't let your emotions get in the way. Realize that not everything you read in the news is actually what happens. The sky is not falling. Chicken Little is not running around, or Chicken Little is running around, but ignore him, right? But let's just stop and think logically about how this could affect you. And so, in this video, I'm not going to give you a bunch of answers because, each of your individual contexts is going to be different. But I am going to, talk about a few things, pose some things that others in the group talked about, maybe some things organizations are looking at. And, as I said, kind of ask you some questions so you can start thinking, does my audit plan need to change? Do I need to shift my priorities this year? And how do I kind of keep on top of this? Right? Because one of the issues, and again, this comes back to classic risk management topics, where as the context around you changes, and so that could be an external context, internal context, some culture, stakeholder regulatory expectations. Anytime those things change, it's important for us to stop and consider them and decide if our risks have changed. Now, we usually talk about risk management, but I want to remind you again, not all of these things or events that are happening are necessarily threats that lead to risks. For some organizations, they're actually opportunities that can lead towards rewards as well. And so I want you, that's one of the points, is to make sure that you're stopping and thinking about, are these things actually, hurting or helping our organization, or do we need to change as a result of it? Okay. So, again, some of the different things that have happened, obviously, in the last few days, there have been some changes about some of the conflicts in the world, about how those things may end, about how things may progress going forward. There's been, some changes in government funding. There's been, certain departments and other things that have effectively been shut down by the U.S. government. Lots of governmental layoffs and other things like that, and just a lot of things. Okay. And like I said, I'm going to talk about a few of them just to try to give you some ideas of how you can start to think about this, how you can start to ask yourself some questions, and how you can determine whether or not you need to make any changes. And like I said, some organizations are going to feel one way, others are going to feel a different way. So an example of this is, one of the recent things that's happened is the federal government pretty much said, look, all the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act issues that are on the table, we're going to put them on hold. And so what this is kind of, reading through the lines and some of the things that people have said, is sounding like the U.S. government is not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which means that a lot of the rules U.S. companies have had to follow around the world may no longer be enforced or may be overturned. And so, again, for some organizations, this may be an opportunity. Like, hey, we felt that they were unfair anyway. Now we can actually compete with other international firms. And so they may decide, right, to change how they do business based on that context change from the federal government. Other organizations may choose not to do so. And so we had a real life example actually on the call. As we were talking about some of these things, one of the heads of internal audit got an email from the head of compliance reminding people in the organization that their organization would continue to follow the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that they would continue to do business under those rules because they felt like that was the right thing to do. And in fact, there was going to be more training and other stuff probably coming as a result of it. Okay, now, those are two different ways of thinking about this. Neither one is right, neither one is wrong, okay? But there's a change in the geopolitical context, which means organizations look at these things and decide, should we change our strategy? Should we do things different, right? And so as an example, right, let's say that I was in internal audit at both of these organizations, so I can kind of explain how you may look at this. Well, in the first organization that says, oh, great, this is wonderful, right? We're no longer going to follow FCPA. If you had, certain FCPA activities or audit activities on your plan for this year, it may be a good idea for you to consider pausing and not doing anything about FCPA if your organization has taken that position. Okay. Now, if you're in the other position, like this person who shared, things are going to stay the same in their organization. So if I had planned to do some work around FCPA this year, I would probably continue to do it. Right. And this is true for any of the things that are going on. Some of the banking people that were on the call, one of the things around I'm going to get the acronym probably wrong, but the Consumer Regulatory Group in banking, that was set up after the 2008 issues is also one of those groups that is really being significantly cut back. So a lot of banks are saying this is wonderful, right? These were unrealistic regulations for us to follow. We're glad we don't have to do it. And so again, someone shared, that because of that, they had been asked to put some of their projects on hold. Right, wrong, or indifferent, whether you agree with it or not, right? Because again, we can have, political and personal discussions about this. The fact is that is what appears to be the course for the US government. And so for an organization to say, hey, you know what, some of these projects we've been working on that were specific to these regulations, we're just going to hold off on for a little while, right? Some other ones, that would fall into that same sort of category are some of the things around DEI, some of the things around ESG, again, where some companies are kind of pausing what they're doing until they find out for sure, what the future course is going to be. Now, those are things that are happening in the United States. And so again, as we discussed about some of these things, for example, related to ESG, well, the US may no longer consider ESG a big deal, but guess what? Europe still does. And so the multinational companies that were on the call, as we talked about this, you have to start realizing or thinking about, okay, does that mean as an organization, we're going to start doing business differently in the US than we do in these other countries? And that may be the case, right? You may have different rules, different policies in different places of the world. But again, some things for you to start to consider and think about. So I gave you a few examples, but some of the questions to ask yourself would be things like this, right? Is, as you look at some of these different things that are going on in the world, how does that directly or indirectly impact your organization? Now, for some organizations, there's going to be a very direct impact that you can probably see. But I will tell you, especially if you are a business in the United States, some of these changes will impact you. They'll either be direct or they'll be indirect, but every business in America will be affected by some of these changes. Okay. So maybe you're an organization that relies a lot on federal funding. So one of the organizations that was on our call today, 20 to 30% of their annual budget is coming from federal funds, And so again, you have to take a look at that and think, okay, well, is the area where I'm receiving my federal funding, is that going to be impacted? Is that one of the areas where the change is going to happen, right? Because from a business perspective, if all of a sudden 20 to 30% of your revenues could go away, that can be a big business issue, right? And so it may be an area for internal audit to be looking at, or at least to be asking some questions about, right? And so, again, some of the questions for you to start thinking about, pull out your audit plan, take a look at it, what's on it, have any of the changes that have gone on, are those things that either directly or indirectly impact your organization? Should you maybe pause or defer some of those projects until later? Or should you even add new ones, right? Now, one point to make here as well is, from an internal audit perspective, what do we do, right? Because we're not the ones running the organization, but we can ask questions, right? And a lot of times in, some of these chaotic times where change is happening very quickly, it's not about us making the decision. It's about us asking some of the questions to see if our organization is considering or thinking about some of these things, right? And so, again, as you start to think about some of the ways that your organization could be impacted, you can start asking questions of your executive team, of your board, see what they're concerned with, what they would like to know, a little bit more. So again, those are a few of the things, right, that have been coming about. Now, if we look at things, because again, one of the questions around the Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, how is that going to impact as well, right? Well, we know that probably regulation is going to go down. Regulatory enforcement will probably go down because there's nobody to enforce some of the regulations, right? So, what are the regulations that are affecting your organization? What are the laws that are affecting your organization that may or may not be enforced anymore, like FCPA, right? And so you can almost sit down and start kind of coming up with a list of who your regulators are, the major laws and regulations that you're supposed to follow. And you can take a look at that and start deciding, are some of these changes and things that the government is doing, do those impact those regulations? And if they do, right, is there maybe something different that the organization should be doing? Is there something different that we should be doing, as well? And like I told you before, gave you the FCPA example. Okay. Now, how else, can this affect you, or what are some other things that you should be considering, or thinking about? Well, another thing that is on the table are tariffs. In the United States, they're looking at doing tariffs. And so, again, somebody on the call, even though they're an American company, they're based in 50 different countries. And so they will be affected by the tariffs, right? Because any of the components that they're making around the world or products that are coming into the United States will potentially be subject to a tariff, right? And so, some organizations, we had another person on the call today who literally, some of their executives are right now in Washington, D.C., with legislators and regulators to try to understand what's going on. And so it brings up another point of kind of, again, back to our general risk management principles that we should all be thinking about. Now, a lot of the times when we are doing risk assessments, when we're doing things like developing our audit plan, we do these assessments periodically. And so for a lot of organizations, that means maybe quarterly, most likely it's annual. And as we're seeing that the world is changing quicker, one thing for us to consider is, well, should we look at our context monitoring on a more real-time basis? And if that's the case, right, does that mean that maybe we need other people involved in helping to monitor some of these changes? May not, right? But if you're waiting for a year to kind of reassess your ERM risk assessment or reassess your audit plan, there's going to be a lot of things that happened over the year that you weren't prepared for. And so, even again, from an internal audit perspective, it just is something we've been talking about for a long time, right? Which is audit planning. And a lot of organizations in their internal audit plan, they plan for 1 year at a time, or they plan for a 3 to 5 year plan. Well, we've been saying for a long time that's probably no longer relevant. You need to do something quicker because the world is changing quicker. And so I think one thing that we can especially learn from this is, maybe we should kind of get away from annual audit planning. Now, there's still some planning you have to do on an annual basis related to your head count and your budgeting, staffing, things like that. But the actual projects that you're working on, can we be more nimble at deciding and changing, where we're going to allocate our resources? Are there some things that we need to start doing so we can become more agile in not just performing particular projects, but in even how we are changing our audit plan and our areas of focus? I think it's a great time to actually embrace it and to, stop thinking that annual and 3-year plans are the way for us to go. It requires different skill sets, other things like that. But I think if you haven't done that already, it's one thing for you to consider at this point, right? So, what other things, right, should we be thinking about? And some of these as well could be things that you may not be thinking about, because towards the end of the call, as an example, one of the individuals raised the point and said, there's so much energy being spent by the government on fraud, waste, abuse, efficiencies. Maybe, is that an area that we should be looking at more? And again, it may or it may not for your organization, right? It's going to depend on the context. But when we see things like that happening in the world around us, it's good to ask questions just like that, right? What can we learn from what's going on in the world around us? How can our organization do things differently based on that? And again, it's not that we're necessarily copying or doing things like that, but I can't remember which came first, Uber or Airbnb, but it's an example like this, right? Where one of those companies kind of started and said, aha, we can use this technology platform and we can create a whole new business around, using kind of ride share or stay share, if you want to call it, and start competing with the hotels. Okay. Now, once somebody started that or somebody had the idea, the other one said, well, now hold it. If they can do that in hotels, or they can do that with rideshare, maybe we could do that with hotels or rideshare as well. Right. And so again, in some of these times of change, it's a great opportunity for us to start seeing, how other people outside of our industry or other organizations are handling or dealing with some of these things. And what can we learn from it? And what can we then take and customize to make it work for us? And so some of this, again, it goes back to, kind of one of the original questions from our call today, which is, man, how did Doge find all this stuff so quick? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but obviously something happened, right? And so, can we learn from that from an internal audit perspective? Can we get faster at analyzing data? Can we get faster at making conclusions, right? And again, we don't know that everything that's been put out there from Doge is true and that it's been fact checked and all that kind of stuff, right? I'm not going there, but and again, regardless of what you personally believe about what's happening, but what can we learn from it? And I think one of the things that we learn from it is this. And again, whether you agree with it or not doesn't matter, right? But the context in how government is run in the US has changed significantly. In the past, when issues would be brought up, right, it was kind of a ho hum and it was continue the status quo. And I'll give you an example, right? There was a time when one of the inspector generals, I think, came forward and gave some testimony to Congress about the fact that $2 trillion was unaccounted for at the Pentagon. 2 trillion with a T was unaccounted for at the Pentagon. At the time, it made some headlines. People talked about it a little bit. But what actually happened? I don't think a lot actually happened. The difference between then and now is when those things come out, the government actually changes things. Now, why is that? Because some of the roadblocks have been removed. So, we learn from this all over, and this is one of the things that we've seen. Again, here is a metaphor of what's going on in the government and how we may be able to apply that to business as well. Is, after really the Great Depression and the start of the New Deal that Roosevelt put in place, there have continued to be layers and layers and layers and layers of new government agencies, new laws, new government spending, right? That has just continued to layer and layer and layer and layer on top of itself, which obviously has led to some inefficiencies in government, right? If you've ever dealt with a lot of government agencies, you know that there's inefficiencies built in there, right? You know that they're spending money that maybe they don't need to spend because maybe there's duplication, other things like that going on, right? And again, I'm not here to say anything about this from a political opinion standpoint. I'm just saying we've seen that happen in the US government. I've seen for a long time in organizations how there continues to be new controls, new policies layered on top of each other, layered on top of each other, that have made it more difficult for organizations to actually do business because they're spending so much of their time in duplication, in not being as efficient as they could be, yada, 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 right? So, can we learn something from the government? What if we remove some of those roadblocks and we do start looking at some efficiencies in our organization and reduce some of the controls that are there? Is that something that we can do? Of course it is. Is it something that's right for your organization? I don't know. You have to look at the context. You have to ask some of the right questions. But what I will tell you is, since the culture in general is looking at that, I'm sure that there are probably a lot of corporate executives that are out there that may be thinking about the same thing. And so I could see that you're going to also see a lot of efficiencies and cost cutting in some organizations around the world as well. So with that, I'm going to kind of wrap up for today because I'm coming up on my time for this video. But, again, kind of as a recap is, agree, disagree personally about what is going on in the world doesn't matter for what I'm talking about today. What does matter, though, is, that we start looking at these changes that are happening and start, realizing the direct and indirect impacts that these things can have on our organizations. And when we do that, right now, then we have to make the link back to our audit plan. Does that mean I should be doing something different because the context has changed? And I would say for probably almost every organization that is listening to this video, the answer is yes. Something needs to change. I don't know what it is for your organization, but when you start asking some of the questions and thinking about some of the things that I talk about in this video today, you're going to start understanding what those things are. You'll start to change, where your priorities are this year. Because as I said, I think most organizations, your priorities probably just changed. And it's time for us to actually be honest with ourselves about it and realize, what the best way is for us to change going forward. So with that, thank you for listening. I'll see you on the next video.